Chairman, I won't. It's just late in the evening. I think most of the questions I was going to ask are already been asked, but I just touched on a few that I want to clarify again. And I'd have to say, you provide a very good service here, and a very worthy service and needed now with every parents working, both parents working, etc. But I would have to say, without all the grandmothers and grandfathers in this country, your service would be under very serious pressure. So fair play to all the grandmothers in particular that are minding grandchildren around the country. Include my own wife. No, I just want to ask you, surplus to the surrender back in 2017 and 18, 58.7 million in 17 and 48.5 million in 16, the waiting list out there, there's a demand for the service. In my own constituency, people are coming to me looking for start-up services. Why wasn't this money utilised instead of being handed back and given to upstarts, new starts, whatever you want, for childcare? When there was such a demand for it there, why hand it back? There's such. It doesn't sound right that there's such a demand for childcare and money is scarce, and there were money there, and yet just hand it back instead of giving it out to new recruits or new start-ups.
Well, Deputy, the main reason for not handing it back in the first instance was it wasn't clear how much, if any, underspend there would be until very late into the year. It was really September after the recruitments and start-offs from September that year. So it was very late in the year before you could make a clear judgment that that would be the extent of underspend during the year. Secondly, it's not
that
a case...
That doesn't sound, that you have to wait till the end of the year before you know that you'll have 40
or
50 million left over. That doesn't sound right.
Well, the reason for that is the nature of the childcare schemes. The new entry point is September each year. So that's the critical point at which you can judge what you're going to need. And our estimate of money requirements was on the basis of the full year, taking account of the fact that the new term, so to speak, starts in September. So that was why we were in that difficult situation. But in addition to that then, it's not a case of just simply being allowed to spend the money on something else. Money, particularly of that magnitude, would normally have to be surrendered to the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and the government would have to make a decision on alternative spending rather than us simply saying, well, we'll spend it somewhere else within the TUSLA or within the Department of Children and Youth Affairs vote, even though it may be the case that we could identify particular areas where it could be spent.
And what's the situation now, 18-19, or the present situation?
In 18 and 19,
have we had any surrenders this year?
No. In 18, in fact, we had a small supplementary that we required at the end of 18, and the reason for that was because essentially the early years component moved upwards and achieved its targets, and the same will have happened in 2019. So we actually ended up with the requirement for a small supplementary at the end of. And is there funding available for new start-ups now? I mean, everyone, there's such a demand, and are there still monies available? Well, we have money in the base now for the current year and for our plans for the current year, and obviously for 2020 there will be the normal estimates process during which we will make a pitch for funding for 2020 and beyond. But it is important to say that we have utilised the money in full, both for 2018 and will do so in 2019.
Okay, so that sounds good. Just control over early years childcare programme. I was just looking through the report here that on public verification checks indicate that 14% of contracts are non-compliant. 14% out of 320 million, which was before roughly 45 million. Does this imply that there was risk and value for money? Why is that there? Non-compliant, what does that mean?
Non-compliant essentially means, and when it's major non-compliant, the issue is where services have failed to count in full detail and reflect in full detail the attendances.
Is that money correct, 45 million?
That money, we have updated our estimates for a number of years, and this morning I was describing what was actually happening in terms of overclaims and so on. So we have significantly updated figures, and I was explaining this morning as well how for earlier...
I was here.
Yes, sorry. For earlier years there was a question of rules and specificity of those rules to determine whether or not the money was actually repayable or not, and then for later years when we specified more clearly in the rules what was required in terms of attendances. The figures that we're now working from were the ones that I talked about this morning, the 937,000 for 2018 and the 4.7 million for 2018.
Will that money be recovered?
Yes.
It can be got back?
It can be got back either by way of recoupment through subsequent reduction or through a requirement not to make the payment in the first place, because some of the compliance visits would have identified the problem before the money was actually being paid.
So of the 14% or 45 million, much of that will be recovered?
Well, we've moved on, I think, from that from that figure at this stage, and these are the ones that we would work off now.
Now, would they falsify, like just asked earlier on?
No, I don't believe it was falsification.
When they pay, the checking of, someone supposed to have a child for 8 hours a day and maybe only have it for 2 hours, but they're getting paid for 8 hours. I'm not going over the same ground as
sure. No, I appreciate
but, but how do you stop that? Have you spot checks? How do you control it?
We can stop
Is it still happening out there?
No, we can stop it now because we have much better systems in place. We have the PIP system in place, and we also have, we're moving to the NCS, the National Childcare Scheme, which is attendance based. It's based on subsidies for a specific child for a specific period during the year. So we can greatly reduce and hopefully stop.
Without inspection?
Well, there will still be inspections, there will still be spot checks, there will still be compliance visits and so on. But the system we now have in place and will have in place under the National Childcare Scheme is significantly improved from the rather basic scheme that existed before.
So the spot checks, we say Kilkenny, Carlow, would they be taken on a regular basis, or just would everyone be visited once a year? Or?
No, the approach that Pobal has been taking is to visit, to carry out compliance visits on the basis of specific criteria, and the major criteria were size of the payment being made, and therefore risk to the exchequer if money was being overpaid to providers, and also then the specific schemes. The schemes where we had the most difficulty were the CCS and the CCSP. The ones where we had the least difficulty would have been Etche, where the proportion of overclaim was very small indeed. There were 1,700 visits by Pobal last year, and a focus then this year, so far 700 this year, on the higher risk cases. So there is a concentrated.
What percentage was compliant and what percentage was non-compliant of those visits? What percentage?
I don't have
roughly,
I don't have that figure directly in front of me, but the result of it for last year was, as I say, this 4.7 million figure. Sorry, I do have a figure in front of me in terms of overall overclaim. The 4.7 represented about 2.2% of the contract value, 433 million worth of payments, and the estimated overclaim that would emerge if we didn't get it back, which we will, the 4.7 million, would be 2.2%. But I should say it's higher in the problem schemes, the CCS and the CCSP, and that's where the compliance visits focused.
And just to follow up on what my colleague said, is the policy to go for bigger creches or smaller creches? In rural areas, the smaller creches, 10, 15, 20s. Or is the policy, what is the general policy? Do you go for bigger creches where there's 40, 50s or more? Or do you like smaller creches at 10, 15? And what is the best policy? What is
I might ask Ms McNally, because she was dealing with it before, to deal with that.
So I have to say the approach that we take is very much to respect parental choice, and we know that in Ireland there are parents who want to have choices. So we make all our supports available to all services. So smaller services can apply for them and larger services can apply for them. I should also say, in relation to
what is the average, the average?
The average size at the moment is 44.
44, that's the average size.
That's the average size.
That's large, yeah.
I should also say that we're talking a lot today about centre-based childcare, but clearly for parents, a lot of parents choose to use childminders, and childminders have been a very unregulated profession to date. We're planning, the Minister is considering an action plan at the moment to really look at how we can support childminders to become registered so that they can access the National Childcare Scheme as well, and again improve access, improve affordability, improve quality.
You mean they come regulated in, like everyone else?
Yes, but we're looking at how we could regulate them in a manner that we support them, etc., that it's not a burden on them, that we do it in an incremental way, and that there's something in it for them as well, that we're giving them quality supports, etc. So that's acknowledging that a lot of parents will choose small ratios for their children, the consistency of relationship, etc., small numbers.
Now, another complaint I get from constituents is that, because of the 2-year preschool, that a lot of creches have gone for this because the money is in that, and that's where the most money. So it's excluding, we say, the 0-6, the young baby up to that age, and that seems to be becoming a problem that the providers moving towards the preschool because it's better money and better paid, and that the other babies are being left out of the system, and they're finding it hard to get places. We could have an opinion on that.
So certainly ECHE provides stable income for families. They know in September that they're going to, for providers, stable income. They know in September that they're going to have 38 weeks of income from the department. They know exactly what they're going to get paid. If they sign up whatever number of children at the beginning of the year, they broadly know they'll have those children to the end of the year. But there's drawbacks to it as well, in that we only give 38 weeks funding. We don't give them funding over the summer. So whilst, again, media coverage has said ECHE is extremely attractive and the other isn't, there's a little bit of a question mark about that as well. Certainly, what I mentioned to the Deputy earlier on, in 2014 we had 13,000 places for under threes. In 17-18 we had 31,433. So that is, that's the cold hard data on the fact that yes, there are some services absolutely that have closed their baby rooms and wobbler rooms, etc., and are focusing on ECHE. But there's still a lot of others who are doing the under threes. Now we need more. We absolutely need more, and we are working to try and increase that.
Another complaint that seems to be coming into the constituency more is from after school hours, from 3 to 5, or whatever it is. That seems to be becoming a problem again. And I was going to. That's one of the reasons why I came back to ask you about on public the recent complaints audit and complaints reports audit, and it's putting pressure on. And I'm talking about childcare providers who have come to me from Carlow, Kilkenny in particular. And I raised this with the Minister last week or 2 weeks ago in a question on the floor. And the non-profit community are saying, because of these new regulations that are coming in, I just want to ask you, when I have you here in front of you, the new regulations are coming under the compliance audit, it's going to put more pressure and financial pressure on, because I think there's 1 to 10 or something, and it used to be 1 to 20, now 1 to 10. I haven't the exact figures, but they're saying that they are for non-profit, and they're saying that there will be more funding will have to be made available if they're going to comply with the new regulations, if you want to call that, the new audits that Public has and they're actually going to meet the Minister, they're coming up to meet the Minister group to see more funding, I suppose they're saying, because of the regulations that's been brought in under this new audit. Could you give me a comment on that, please? So
there's 2 challenges facing school-age childcare services, and the first is about the ratio, but the Secretary-General mentioned this earlier. The ratio we brought in is 1 adult to 12 children. Let's say parents are paying €5 an hour for after-school care. That's €60, when we know that service is paying that staff member about €12. So that's quite a significant profit margin. So for services,
they're saying they're non-profit, they're not making any money.
Well, yeah, but
providing the service.
It is hard to know. So some services are charging, right, and they're different. But if there's 18 children in a room and they're charging for that, there is some profit there. The other thing that's happening is that when the National Childcare Scheme is introduced, some children who have a parent at home will not be entitled to after-school care. So in the past, disadvantaged children or whatever with the CCS could attend for 40 hours a week even though there was a parent at home. The National Childcare Scheme has been built with an anti-poverty policy built into it. So what we're saying is, if there is a parent at home, you will only get 15 hours off subsidised or free, heavily subsidised for many. You will only get 15 hours. So some of those services that were reliant on children coming for 40 hours or going to school for 5 or 6 hours and then coming for a few hours, they will no longer have that income for those few hours.
But they have to be a parent at home, though, wouldn't they?
If there is a parent at home, the children will be going home. But if the parent is working even for a couple of hours a week or in training for a few hours a week, we will give them the 40 hours. So it is a labour activation measure. It is an anti-poverty measure. It is going to be a huge change for a lot of these services. Absolutely it is, and it's creating huge challenges for them. But we could argue that, there's more children out there. We hear sometimes about waiting lists, etc. There may be other children that can take their place. We've done lots of work on looking at sustainability. We've a report that's coming to completion on it. the Secretary-General mentioned that we have a sustainability budget, so we have 1.7 million sustainability funding every year. If services are in crisis because they're losing income and they need to transition to a kind of a better, more viable model, we will work with them. There's this case management system to work with them to look at how they can cope with this change.
And is this ratio of 12 to 1 is going to be enforced? Because they were telling me they had the system they had in place as 20 to 1, and now this new rules and regulations are bringing them down to 12 to 1, so it means extra staff, and that having the funding then they're talking about here in letters I've got, they're talking about some of the creches closing down, or some services closing down, and these are, as I said, non-profit services in Kilkenny City in particular.
So we would, we talked before about, first and foremost, we have to do what's right for children, and there's lots of evidence to say that a 1 to 20 ratio school-age
These are after school now,
but even in after school, because it's different to a classroom. Okay, there might be 1 in 30 in a classroom, but they're sitting at a desk most of the time, they're following a curriculum, there's a teacher there might be a principal down the corridor, there might be a secretary, there might be an SNA, etc. There may be other available supports. In school-age childcare, it's often one provider. In out of term, it can be long days. They could be there for 10 hours. It's multiple age groups, so you could have 5-year-olds and 12-year-olds. So it's a very different challenge. And I have to say that ratio wasn't. Obviously the minister approved it in the end, but it was the recommendation of an expert group.
12 to 1 is the recommended.
They actually recommended 11 to 1.
12 to 1.
12 to 1 is the new regulation.
So you can't have any more than 12 to 1.
You have to have a second adult in the room.
And then the big question I'm asking then, if that has been enforced, will the extra funding made available to these voluntary communities?
Well, we would argue that if we had extra funding to give, is that where we would give it? Because we would think that if they're already getting €60, let's say, and their outgoing is only €12, because staff are their main costs. So because staff in this sector are not on the highest wages.
This is all about staff, right? And the cost of staff and providing staff.
But the reality is staff are paid €12.17 an hour. That is what they were paid in 17-18. So I don't think we could allow the needs of children to be trumped by a bigger margin.
That's not just Chairman. Just the last thing. Are you responsible for adoptions? And does that come under your remit? Just to have just adoptions.
The adoption authority comes under.
That's under your remit, isn't
yes.
it? Yeah. And how's that working here? Because I had complaints about the adoption system here in Ireland. Are you happy with the system that's been implemented here?
Well, there are major issues for us.
And I want to ask you about foreign adoption as well.
Sure, there are major issues for us in relation to the future way in which adoption operates. The single biggest issue we want to deal with at the moment is an information and tracing bill, which the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs is bringing through the Oireachtas at the moment.
Are they some hold up at the moment on all adoptions? All adoptions stopped at the moment?
No.
No, I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't have said that, but I just
not at all. What is creating a difficulty at the moment is, in advance of the legislation, the information and tracing legislation being passed, social workers are finding it very difficult to help with existing approaches to information and tracing, and that's done through TUSLA. One of the issues is GDPR. I'm not trying to lay everything at the door of GDPR, but with data requirements and data protection requirements there, it is much more difficult for social workers to trace birth mothers and others through the system because of requirements of GDPR.
So it's not at a standstill, it's still working, but in a different, slowly.
Elements of it, as I understand it, elements of it are running into serious difficulty. I'm not going to say that they're at a standstill, but elements of it are certainly running into difficulty.
Because there's parents out there, who are expecting to get adoptions within a certain time. That's how I'm asking it, because...
But let me stress, that's in relation to information and tracing now, as opposed to the adoption system, whereby parents or prospective adoptive parents would be being assessed for appropriateness for adoption, which is a very, very different service, and that is continuing as normal.
And just in foreign adoptions then, we have arrangements with some countries adoptions, yes. and there's other countries who are trying to get arrangements with. Is that still working to the advantage of parents here that want to adopt in this country?
The system is continuing, certainly. I don't have figures in front of me as to the number of foreign adoptions, but certainly the system is continuing. It's easier in the Hague Convention countries, as we call them, but some other countries that have expressed an interest in becoming involved, or where the adoption authority has been interested interested in involving them. It's a more involved process because it requires a bilateral treaty, government decision and so on. But certainly the existing system with the existing countries is operating.
But the outlook then for, we say, parents are seeking adoptions is good for them into the future, whether foreign or local or home.
Yeah, it's certainly continuing as it was before, and I'm not aware of any specific difficulties that would prevent that from happening in the future, subject obviously to the availability of children, and that raises all sorts of issues as to the availability of children in different countries.
And the last question, why is the traceability more difficult now? What was the system heretofore? Why is this new criteria being brought in and new regulations being brought in again? Are there a reason for this?
Yeah, the system is connected with GDPR and the requirements of GDPR, and up to now the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection could link in with TUSLA's records and compare notes, so to speak, where a TUSLA social worker was trying to identify an individual potential birth parent. In the context of GDPR, the Department of Employment and Social Affairs has concluded that it can't do that at the moment, but the information tracing legislation that I've just been referring to will contain a specific provision allowing for that to happen again.
Okay, Chairman,
thank you.
that's all.
Finally, and just